I want to welcome everybody to our first BB&T Pre-Market Process Speaker Series for the spring semester. And I want to thank the Student Finance and Investment Club for helping to host the event and cooperating with us to be able to sort of hijack their meeting and take advantage of this opportunity. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Professor Peter Calcano, and I'm the Director of the Initiative for Public Choice and Market Process. I'm a professor here at Economics, and you'll see that when you came in, you were handed a attendance card and a survey. If you will fill those out for us, there's a box that you can drop them in on the way back. We appreciate the feedback, helps us to understand what you liked, didn't like about the speakers, as well as give us a head count, excuse me, and determine who's here and so forth. We'll provide that information to faculty members if any of you have been properly incentivized to attend. I encourage you to find us on the web, find us on Facebook, and you can actually follow us on Twitter. Right? So if you're interested, I'll do a quick prelude to that. Right after spring break, shortly after spring break, March 18th through the 22nd, we will be hosting our 5th annual Adam Smith Week. We should be having approximately 7 or 8 events over the course of 5 days, including some very well-renowned speakers in economics and philosophy. The mission of the Initiative for Public Choice and Market Process is to advance the understanding of the economic, political, and moral foundations of a free society. And so we do this in a variety of ways, including this BB&T Speaker Series. And so we'd like to take advantage of this opportunity to have a variety of guest speakers. Before we get to our guest speaker tonight, I'm going to turn the floor over very quickly to Professor Blackwell, who's got a quick announcement, and then to Daniel Green to do our introductions.
Okay, so I'm not a sponsor, but this is a commercial break. I'm here advertising for my Maymester class, Econ 350, Financial Markets in the U.S. Economy. This looks like a good audience to pitch this class to. So many of you, I imagine, are taking finance classes, and that's well and good. This class gives you more of an economics perspective on the markets. We talk about the capital asset pricing model. We do some other stuff. We do a lot of active learning exercises. I see some folks from my experimental economics class here, including some trading, not exactly like this, but trading in a simulated market to give you some experience. Anyway, it's a lot of fun. Students that have taken the class in the past have enjoyed it. And I should also mention again, if you're doing a finance concentration or minor, in the past, the economics and finance department has accepted this class as an elective in that program. So that's another good reason to take the class, and because it's a lot of fun. Anyway, thank you for the commercial break, and I'd like to introduce Daniel Green to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming out. I'd like to introduce Jordon tonight. He received his doctorate in economics from UCLA. Before joining the bank, he was a senior vice president and director of research at the Federal Reserve Bank in St. Louis. And then he was also a member on President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors in 1981 and 1982. And then Mr. Jordon was also the former president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland from 1992 until 2003. Without further ado, Mr. Jordon.
Thank you very much. Starting off with an instant update of what happened in the markets is interesting from the perspective of what it was like when I first, how do we get rid of this thing? There we go. When I left graduate school, which I'll have some other things to say about changes since then, and went to work in the Federal Reserve the first time, because we didn't have Bloomberg and we didn't have monitors. We couldn't produce this sort of thing. In fact, it took our chartists about a week to paste together one little chart for something, so we had to be careful about what we asked for. But I hadn't been there very long, and Milton Friedman came to visit. We're having a luncheon conversation, and the director of research was talking about the debate going on. Should we have a Dow Jones ticker tape? A Dow Jones ticker tape was this machine that spit out paper all day long about what was going on in the markets, and what was happening around the world of events in a little news blurb. Sort of the early version of Twitter-linked statements about something, ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk. And so the director of research, with the president of the bank sitting there, said, well, Professor Friedman, do you think that we should have a Dow Jones ticker tape outside the president's office? And Milton Friedman said, of course he should, absolutely, on one condition, that he never looks at it. And today, people react to all of the things that get said. Even people they've never heard of before in the Federal Reserve, affiliated with the Federal Reserve. One of the amusing things at the times that I was in the Federal Reserve, both in the early years in St. Louis and later in Cleveland, is we would have a lot of professors become members for a few years of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. And they would always tank the markets. Because they would say the same thing to a group like this with the press present that they would have said in their classroom a month or a week before, and all of a sudden they're a governor of the Federal Reserve Board. And they say the same exact words, and they tank the market. Because now it's who they are and where they are. As the Wall Street Journal used to say, where you stand depends on where you sit. Actually, I thank you for not opening with a joke about economists and how everybody loves to laugh at economists. I was a business economist a couple of times for a commercial bank, and I gave a lot of what were called forecasting speeches, traveling around all over the western United States. And it was almost invariable that a banker or somebody from some other business would introduce with a joke about economists. And one of the favorites that I heard for years and years and years was a story about two men in a hot air balloon. And they've been floating along up there for some time, and the cloud cover obscures the ground. They can't see the ground. They don't know where they are. They're completely lost. And a hole opens up in the clouds, and they can see a man in the field down below. And they yell down to him, where are we? The man in the ground yells back up, you're in a balloon. Cloud closes and they float along, and one of the guys in the balloon says, who do you suppose that guy was down there? The other one says, I don't know who he was, but he had to be an economist. Why do you say that? Who else could say something that was so accurate, so succinct, and so utterly useless? And I don't know whether what I'm going to say to you tonight is going to be utterly useless, but it's not going to be succinct, and maybe not even accurate. I don't know. In the spirit of the times, in what's going on in the federal government with what's called entitlement spending and the unfunded liabilities of the government, which we'll be talking about, and the state level, and city levels, and county levels of the pension systems, and in some places even the promises of the healthcare system and so on. I am here to tell you tonight that I have changed my will. I have written into my will that my executor is instructed that I have 3 children. When I'm gone, he's to give each of my 3 children a 40% share of my estate and distribute the rest of it equally among my 5 granddaughters. And even the 10-year-old can figure out this may not work out too well. But like a member of Congress, it won't be my problem. This is going to happen a long time after I'm gone, or at least the members of Congress hope that that's the case. We'll see. I'm going to start with 2 quotes, and you're supposed to guess at who the quotes are. And one of them I have to leave a little incomplete. Quote, owners of capital will stimulate the working class to buy more and more of expensive goods, houses, and technology, pushing them to take more and more expensive credits until their debt becomes unbearable. The unpaid debt will lead to bankruptcy of banks, which will have to be nationalized, and the state will have to take the road which will lead eventually to blank. I'll finish that in a minute. The historians among you should be guessing who that is. But another quote. People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but for the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. That same author bitterly complained about the common propensities in the business world to try to monopolize and to collude and to conspire against workers and against the public to seek government protection against competition. The first quote ends with the word, eventually lead to communism, Karl Marx, Das Kapital, 1867. The second quote was 90 years earlier, Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. Karl Marx and Adam Smith agreed. For Marx, it was hopeful. For Smith, it was worrisome that the natural order of things would lead to what we today call crony capitalism, and then to corporatism or statism. Everyone is familiar with the famous quote of Benjamin Franklin when he came out and the people said, "What kind of government will we have?" And he said, "A republic if you can keep it." Really important words. Had they asked him what kind of an economy we will have, he would have said, "A market economy if you can keep it." The reality is there is a natural process of mutations, kind of Darwin about this, biological stuff, that as the political system has a tendency to mutate, so does, into crony capitalism, so does the market economy. They tend to go together. Thomas Jefferson worried about centripetal forces and centrifugal forces. And he said over time, the centripetal forces of going towards the center will have a tendency to dominate unless there's a conscious and deliberate effort to push it out from the center, push power away from the center. It will always tend to go towards the center if you don't consciously push it away. Better stop hitting that thing. And so we get the expression that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Okay, before I get into the announced topic of debts, deficits, and taxes, policy, and so on, I want to take a little bit of a detour for a specific purpose about where we are in this process. And it kind of fits in with the opening presentation about the markets in a way. When I was in graduate school, a very long time ago, the big thing was IBM antitrust suits. The Department of Justice, and then other parts of the government also, were suing the pants off of IBM for being a monopolist. Now, a lot of you probably even haven't heard of IBM anymore, but they still exist, let alone thinking, what on earth were they thinking, that they were going to monopolize the entire computer industry? Whoever would have thought such a thing? Well, they did. They were serious about it. And for a couple of decades, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars were spent in the litigation. It was spent by professors as expert witnesses on both sides. It was in exam questions. It was in PhD dissertations, and lots and lots and lots of court cases. And then something happened. Microsoft. Oh, it's not the hardware, it's the software. Oh damn, we were fighting the wrong war. So now, what do? Drop the suit against IBM, monopolizing the computer hardware industry. Let's sue Microsoft. And I think the Europeans may still be suing Microsoft. So off to the races again. Dissertations written, exam questions in economics classes, who knows how many of them. Expert witness, court cases, wonderful cases all around the world about how Microsoft is monopolizing the software industry. And then something happened. Apple, no damn, dropped the suit against Microsoft. Well, not too awful long ago, the Department of Justice decided, and not just in the US, but other parts of around the world, especially the Europeans, I got a great idea, let's sue Google. Great, okay, so let's go out there and sue Google. And Google looks at what happened to Microsoft, what happened to IBM, and said, we've got a better approach. Let's open an office in K Street in Washington, hire some spouses or kids of congressmen or former congressmen to staff the office, gave them a $25 million budget and said, make this go away. And it went away. Just like that. And now Facebook is saying, forget the advertising budget, forget the lawyers, forget all of the experts. We're gonna just open an office in Washington. That's a very sad commentary about where we are in this whole dynamics. When I was growing up out in California, I read a biography of a bank. People write biographies about books. I read a biography about a bank. The Bank of Italy, which was headquartered in San Francisco. Subtitled The Bank That Giannini Built. And he merged with another bank in Los Angeles, so they thought, well, maybe the name Bank of America is a better name than the Bank of Italy. And then they merged and acquired banks in Chicago, Seattle, Boston, ultimately Charlotte, North Carolina, Nations Bank. They acquired Merrill Lynch, the big investment banking company. They acquired Countrywide Savings in Southern California. So all over the country, big offices, corporate banking out of Chicago, retail banking out of San Francisco and out of Charlotte and Boston, and foreign, especially Latin America banking out of Boston. Quiz question. Where does the CEO of Bank of America live? Washington, D.C. He said in order to run a major banking company today, you've got to be in and involved with the political leaders. Not New York, not Chicago, not Los Angeles. He's got to run this bank where he can rub shoulders at the A-list cocktail parties in Washington, D.C. Sad commentary about where we are. Probably banking is the most cronyist, if that's a word, of all of our industries. But ultimately, we will either have to nationalize them and run them as public utilities and give the heads of the bank a civil service salary, or we will supervise and regulate them to the point that they can't compete. The governor of the Federal Reserve that is now responsible for supervision announced in a speech last October after they'd approved a merger. He said, if you're one of the largest, I don't remember what it was, 15 banking companies or whatever it is, don't bother filing another application for a merger. It ain't gonna be approved. We don't care what the deal is, what the economics are, what the benefits to shareholders, global competitiveness, or anything. We're not gonna approve it, so don't spend the money on it, because that's done. The alternative is allow these huge corporations that have access to the safety net to have a cheaper cost of credit than the small competitors and drive them all out of business. And we're left with a handful of giant banks that run all of banking business in the whole country. An oligopoly, not an outright monopoly. Two extremes. Smother them to death with supervision and regulation so that it's permission and denial. Hat in hand, go to Washington. May I open a branch? May I do this? May I have a new product? And of course, if you have to go to Washington and ask for permission, you better take along your government affairs officer and the head of your political action committee in order to get that permission. That's kind of how it's done in Europe today. So either you have supervisory regulatory oppression, or you allow them to use the access to the safety net and drive everybody else out of business, and you're basically down to an oligopoly. Or, I don't know. It's not a stable situation. In a very important sense, the environment that we're in is unsustainable. And as a very smart guy once said, things that are unsustainable have a habit of ending. If he'd have lived longer, he might have got a Nobel Prize for that. Okay, I'm going to ask for seriously, I'm going to ask for a show. I'm going to switch now and talk about tax policy and debts and deficits and all of that. So I'm going to ask for a show of hands. I'm going to give you two alternatives. And you can actually vote for both, if you want. What kind of a system of tax collection should we have in the United States? Choice number one, we should have a uniform, fair, efficient, effective method with the least deadweight loss of collecting revenue to finance the government. That's choice number one. Second, we should have a system that is intended to alter not only social behavior, but individual behavior. Taxes on cigarettes and other things that are viewed as bad. Tax subsidies and credits and so on for things that are desirable, that we want to encourage. Choice number one, uniform fair fish. Second, alter social and individual behavior. Well, hands up for system number one. Second, alter social or individual behavior. Sin taxes and all those kind of things. Hands up. A few. Let me give you a third alternative, and you can vote for this one too. If you like the first two, eat one of them or both of them, or different, you can vote for the third one. How about a system that maximizes campaign contributions for congressional re-election every 2 years? Hands up. Come on. That's the tax system we have. And we, the people, decide what our government does, right? So why do we have that kind of a tax system if you all don't think it's the right tax system? Clearly, somebody thinks it's the right tax system. We have taxes right now on the importation of Chinese tires, because it's not fair. That's a good tax, right? Some people think so, obviously. We have it. We have excise taxes on telephones and all kinds of other things. Some people want to tax our internet use, tax for sending emails. We have taxes on user fees, they call them, the taxes on things. We have taxes for going into national parks, user fees. Sometimes we've talked about proportional taxes. Some people have at times in this country, but especially in some European countries, talk about a head tax or a poll tax. Imagine having to pay a tax to exercise your right to vote. Some politicians thought that was a good idea, and Mrs. Thatcher lost her job. It's common to use taxes in a whole lot of ways that economists actually wouldn't have dreamed of. And I mean that in the sense of dreaming. I do my Marco Rubio thing here. When I was at graduate school, getting towards prelims and finishing up, had to take a course in what was called public finance. Basically, it was taxing and spending of government. And I must have been the only graduate student that signed up or something, because I went to see the professor, happened to be the chairman of the Department of Economics, and I said, okay, I signed up for your class. What are we gonna do? He says, well, here's this book, almost 600 pages. Theory of Public Finance, Richard Musgrave. He says, read this book, and at the end of the quarter, you'll take a test. Whoa, it's 600 pages. I'm gonna take one test on this? Now what do I do? So I outlined it. The whole book, filling up stacks of yellow tablets. So to force myself to read every word, as well as every sentence, paragraph, and chapter, and so on, carefully. All the equations, all the diagrams, all of the analysis, the benefits to pay principle, meaning that you tax people more, not just proportionately, but the basis for progressive taxation. Not just everybody pays 10%, or no matter how rich you are, 15%, but the richer you are, proportionally the more you spend, ability to pay principle. Or the benefits principle. We use the benefits principle in a lot of things. Gasoline tax is kind of like a benefits principle, but it's that whoever is paying the tax is because they're getting some service or benefit from government. Analysis about the dead weight loss methods of the ways we go about collecting taxes. Do you want a national sales tax? Do you want a value added tax? How can we use the tax system to bring about more efficient ways of allocating resources to get more productivity and more growth and higher standards of living over time? Shift this curve, solve this equation. All very good things. And spending policies too, but I'm focusing for the moment on taxes. Well, some 15 years later, I was one of a group of economists that was asked to go to testify at a Senate Finance Committee meeting. There was a time when we were talking about having a flat tax, lowering marginal rates, eliminating deductions, trying to change the very, very complicated tax code. At that time, we still had a marginal rate on personal income of 70%, that's 7-0, late 1970s. Everybody agreed the system was broken. Principle number one in Washington is first you gotta convince the people it's broken before you can start putting forward proposals to try and fix the thing. Or as Jack Welch used to say when he was running General Electric, if it ain't broken, break it. And so we would discuss, we went there with written testimony with our proposals of what we thought ought to be done. Russell Long from Louisiana was chairman of the committee, and he at one point, after listening to all of this, said, but we like the tax code the way it is. We use the tax code to encourage things we like and discourage things we don't like, and the people agree with us. Well, the people agree with us. Well, increasingly I came to believe over time he's right, that is the tax system that we the people want. Remember the principle, to tax is to discourage. We know that in most activity. If you tax something, you get less of it. And sometimes it's deliberate, like sin taxes, tax on smoking or something like that. But think about in a broader sense what that principle says. What do we tax today under the Internal Revenue Code and a lot of state codes? If you work, save, invest, innovate, an entrepreneur, that's treated as antisocial behavior that should be discouraged through taxation. Does that make any sense to anyone? But that's what we do. Do we tax people for consuming or for investing? Investing. But every economist knows, no, what you need to do is you need to encourage more investment for growth over time and shift the burden of taxation towards consumption, the argument for value-added tax, and away from taxing investment. After the hearing, we said to a member of the staff, what the heck just happened in there? And his answer came in the form of a question. He said, okay, you guys are proposing these uniform, efficient, effective taxes with little dead weight loss in order to create more growth in the economy? Yeah. Let me ask you, how much campaign contributions is that going to raise? None. There's your answer. Oh, okay. Actually, in 2010, I got a first-hand experience of this because I live in Nevada now. And Senator Reid was in what he thought was going to be a close contest. He didn't because he was able to raise a lot of money. And a member of his staff said that the senator was proposing raising or getting rid of a deduction. I don't know if it's a deduction or exclusion, but something that was in the tax code that benefits casino operators. Millions poured in, and the senator decided not to introduce that, for now at least, unless he decides to run again in 2016. Then he may have to consider again whether or not he might introduce that legislation for that. Some years later, after that hearing, I was testifying again. Senator Lloyd Bentsen from Texas was chairing the committee, and it was on introducing a business form of taxation and doing away maybe with some things in the corporate tax code. And he was going on at some length, as chairman of committees tended to do. And I got my turn and said, Mr. Chairman, as you probably no doubt know, a corporation or any other business can collect a tax and remit the tax, but they can't pay the tax in the sense of the full burden of the taxes. That actually all those taxes that you make businesses and other corporations send in, the real tax is borne by workers in the form of lower after-tax take-home pay, consumers in the form of higher prices of the products they produce, or investors in the form of lower after-tax interest and dividends. So it would be a lot more efficient and less deadweight loss if you just decide who it is you want to tax them directly, and don't go through this avenue of a tax imposed on business. And Senator Benson responded, I understand all that, but you do not run for re-election saying I want to tax workers, consumers, or investors. They're our constituents and they all vote. I just want to tax the business. Good luck with that. That gave rise to the expression, I actually think it came from Senator Long, but at some point, but don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that fellow behind the tree. Even if they really do understand where the burden is falling, they have to come at it indirectly. We're in an environment where corporations and wealthy individuals pay huge sums to lawyers, accountants, lobbyists to find ways to lower their taxes. And politicians like that kind of tax code. The political game is to set as high a marginal tax rate as can be tolerated. We have the highest corporate tax rate in the world, but we don't have the highest corporate tax collections in the world as a percent of income. We have even higher now marginal tax rates. They're now up to, well, including some of the phase outs, into the low 40% for marginal tax rates for individuals. And the political game of setting this high marginal rates is to offer credits, deductions, exclusions, and credits to all kinds of constituent groups that hire the lobbyists and lawyers and the accountants, and find it cheaper to pay all of those people to lower their tax burden than to pay the tax. And if, in fact, we went to something nice and simple, like, say, a 20% corporate income tax with no deductions, no exclusions, no credits, no nothing. You made this amount of money, 20% send it in. Individuals, you made this amount of money, 20% send it in. That would raise more money than the current system for tax revenue for the government. It would leave more money actually to the people. And it wouldn't raise one dime in campaign contributions. So fat chance of us moving to that system. A high marginal tax rates system always means that it will be cheaper to pay the lobbyists, the lawyers, accountants, and so on, the political action committees of the businesses, than it will be to pay the tax. And that's why we can't get tax reform. They'll always talk about tax reform, promising reform, eliminating this deduction, eliminating that exclusion, eliminating that credit, lowering rates, always generates a lot of contributions. Doing it doesn't. Last year we had the episode where it was proposed in the presidential campaign, maybe we will cap deductions for everybody. Some percentage of your income. You can have all the deductions you want for charitable contributions, for medical, for state income taxes, for mortgage, interest paid on your mortgage. But it can only add up to this percentage of your income. And that's all you get. You just pick and choose which one you want. So the parade to Washington started. The churches, the schools that depend on charitable contributions and all of the rest. Well, but you can't eliminate that. Then we would have less charitable contributions. The medical, well, you can't eliminate medical deductions. A lot of states, not Nevada where I live now, because we have no state income tax. And I think there's 9 total that don't have a state income tax. But people in California, Illinois, New York, and so what do you mean, New Jersey? You're going to eliminate the deduction of my state income tax from my federal income tax? In California, it's 13.3% marginal tax rate on your income for California, on top of the 40% that you pay to the federal government. We're up over 50%, and depending on other taxes, property taxes, and excise taxes, and so on, people paying 65% of their income in taxes. And you're saying, but we'll cap your deductions. So you millionaires out there You get to choose deduction on your multi-million-dollar interest on your mortgage, or deduction on charitable contributions, or deduction on the state income taxes you pay, but you can't have them all anymore. The parade of lobbyists was really sort of a spectacle to see. Some propositions. Just as the mere existence of central banks in an environment where you have a fiat currency, meaning it's created out of thin air, it's not backed by gold or some other specie or anything else. The very existence of such a central bank, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, Bank of England, and so on, creates moral hazard because it's a political decision of who gets bailed out, bank or non-bank, as we saw in the 2008 crisis. Just as that creates moral hazard, so does having a fiscal system in which there is no institutional discipline, no effective limit on how much the government can spend. Not balanced budget amendment, not an effective spending limitation amendment, not an effective debt cap, and none of them are effective. So there's moral hazard all over the place. And ultimately, we'll have to address it. The virtue of the pre-1914 gold standard, before World War I, was to, it was also true to some extent, but less so, of the gold exchange standard after World War II for international purposes, but was because it imposed fiscal discipline. It was the monetary system, but the importance of it was the fiscal. We usually try and separate monetary and fiscal. They're not different buckets. And so the virtue of a gold standard monetary system was it forced fiscal discipline. You run out of gold, you can't borrow anymore or spend anymore. You gotta raise taxes. In an actuarial sense, this is gonna sound a little goofy to you, but in an actuarial sense, the federal budget is always balanced. Always. That means that the burden of taxation is whatever the government spends. Cutting tax rates doesn't do diddly squat if you don't do something about spending, either direction, up or down. All current spending by government at the federal level must be paid for by current explicit taxes, a balanced budget, or if there is deficit spending, then by future explicit taxes, which means run surpluses. Hold up your hands, everybody that remembers the last time we had a surplus in the U.S. federal budget. What year? There was a couple in the 1990s. Very few since World War II. And the third way that government spending is always paid by taxes is by the implicit tax of debasing the currency, what we call inflation. After the debts that were run up after World War I, they paid off those debts in the 1920s by running surpluses. In fact, throughout the 19th century, that was mostly the way it was done. You run a deficit for a while for whatever reason, then you gotta run a surplus to pay it off. But after World War II, that didn't happen. Instead, we ended the war in 1945 with debt of over 100% of GDP, something like 110%. And we never did pay it off. What happened was we inflated the denominator, GNP, by debasing the currency. Average effective inflation rate of over 4% over a half a century, and you really reduce the purchasing power of money, and that debt is no longer the kind of burden it was. A corollary to this proposition, the proposition again is that actuarially the budget is always balanced. A corollary is that a reduction of spending is stimulative, and we should reject the idea that that's austerity, that that's contractionary and adversely affects the economy. cutting government spending reduces tax burdens now or in the future, liberates resources for alternative, more productive uses, and is expansionary. I got a great idea for stimulating the economy. Let's cut the budget. You don't hear a lot of politicians talk that way, but then I'm not a politician. Deficit financing, as we're doing now, is deferred taxation. And that taxation could be explicit if we intend to run surpluses, or it can also be shifted taxation to the extent that we can get foreigners to buy the bonds created by the deficits in the present, and then we inflate away the real purchasing power of those bonds over time, pay them back with debased purchasing power dollars. We've shifted the tax burden from American households to foreigners. We did that in spades in the 1960s and 70s. We got away with it for a while. The fiscal dominance hypothesis says that a society that is unwilling or unable politically to achieve and maintain institutionalized fiscal discipline will not be willing to maintain monetary discipline. Monetary expansion, debasing the currency, inflation, will always become the lesser evil to politicians when you consider the alternative of the people you're going to hurt by cutting spending, or the people you're going to hurt by raising their taxes. Historically true instance. During the late 60s, Vietnam, Great Society, inflation starting to take off, Lyndon Johnson said, well, I'm going to take William and Jesse Martin, the head of the Federal Reserve, for a little walk around the Rose Garden and explain to him, we're going to increase spending $30 billion, when $30 billion is a lot of money. And the Federal Reserve is going to pay for it. And his top economic advisor later wrote in his memoir, but Mr. President, that will cause inflation, and inflation is just a different way to tax. And Johnson said, I know that, but it's a tax no one has to vote for. And we got the inflation. Finally, in a fiat currency world, monetary policy is always a fiscal instrument, a way to finance the government. And the idea of having something over here called fiscal policy, something over here called monetary policy, is a mirage. Without effective institutional limitations, somehow maintained like a gold standard, politicians will always vote for more current spending than any tax system that can be designed by the best of the economists can finance. You cannot identify, build, construct, implement with legislation a tax system that would ever generate the revenue to meet the appetite of politicians to spend. So you've got to find a way to limit spending so that maybe tax revenue can catch up and we'll limit inflation. We can talk more. I mentioned balanced budget amendment. There's some problems with that, but I want to leave some time for questions, so let's go to questions now. Or speeches or arguments. Yes, sir.
Dr. Jordon, you perhaps have heard the name Evelyn Y. Davis, a name that's in proxy after proxy, always proposing some corporate governance change, and typically disregarded, in other words, sisters of charity and so forth, or stockholders, routinely dismissed. And there's usually a well-explained reason that the board gives for not considering these proposals. Some of them are harebrained perhaps, but these are the stockholders, usually the small ones, and they don't seem to be given a lot of favor in making these proposals. What would you say, if anything, about the Delaware corporation law and the anti-shareholder sentiments that it may express, where reverse stock splits can wipe out all but 300 shareholders, and the company goes private, and then a lot of people make a lot of money, but the people that originally owned it were wiped out essentially. That kind of thing. It seems that maybe the political forces that you're talking about have affected the very corporation law that governs large public companies.
Yeah, but that takes us right back to where I started, is the political and the economic system will mutate towards cronyism if we don't have an effective way to push it back down to we the people. And right now, we're struggling as a country with that in a whole lot of dimensions. Make no mistake about it, this is a constitutional moment. Now we find out.
If I may, would you say one word about the directors themselves who go along with this program and seem to be quite happy with it generally?
But I didn't come here to talk about mushrooms or potted plants.
Okay.
But the solution is, for a lot of these things, especially in the banking industry, to me, is in corporate governance. Let me ask you a question, not totally rhetorical, but to make a point. During the financial crisis, or what became known as the global economic crisis of 2008, 2009, what happened to Brown Brothers Harriman? Come on. Anybody, what happened to Brown Brothers Harriman? You've read all about it. Oh, no, you haven't. But you read about what happened to Solomon Brothers and Merrill Lynch. What happened to Brown Brothers Harriman? Not a damn thing. They're a partnership. Solomon Brothers had been a partnership. They incorporated, converted the investors to stockholders, and it created the heads I win, tails the taxpayer, first the stockholders, then the taxpayers lose type of dynamics. Brown Brothers Harriman didn't do that because the wealth, maybe double the wealth of every partner was on the line. So they didn't do credit default swaps. They didn't do collateralized debt applications. They didn't, if it was risk they didn't understand, they didn't do it. Bob Rubin, former head secretary of the Treasury, chairman of the executive committee of Citicorp, $100 million in annual compensation, says, I didn't know how a credit default swap worked. Bank directors would come to me in my former job and say, I feel a lot better your guys are in there keeping an eye on things. I say, that's not my job. That's not their job. Their job is to find out whether you're doing your job as a director. All we're checking up on, does internal audit work, does external audit work, are there independent outside directors looking at the risk, and is the compensation appropriate for the risk? And if this is above your pay grade, maybe you shouldn't be on the board. So you've got to change corporate governance. How do you do it? Like Australia. If you're a CEO of a bank, I'll just stick with banks for the moment. You don't get your golden parachute until after you've left the company for 5-7 years. Your pension doesn't kick in. You can't exercise stock options. You're on the board of directors of a bank, you've got double liability for all of the stock that you're required to invest. And you don't get any bonus compensation, performance compensation, till 7 years after you're off the board. Now you might say, who wants to be on the board of a bank? And I would say somebody that is very competent and very honest and very committed to keep a tight rein on management, to make sure this is a sound, well-managed bank. Because there's no way that the stockholders are going to get stuck before me and my heirs get stuck, and I don't want to get stuck. So if you don't fix corporate governance, I don't see that bureaucrats are going to fix it. Imagine some bank examiner from the New York Fed, the controller of the currency, making $140,000 a year, walks into Bob Rubin's office as board of directors of Citibank and says, you know, your portfolio's full of crap and you need to fix it. I don't know who the first phone call will go to. Probably to that former bank examiner's boss, but we've got to, that's one aspect of the crony capitalism that has to be repaired. It's true here, it's true in England, it's true in much of Europe. The Canadians are doing a much better job than we're doing. Little New Zealand is doing a better job, Australia's doing a better job. It's not like we don't know how to do these things, but you've got to overcome all of the campaign contributions that go to the re-election committees to bring about those kind of reforms. It's going to take some real serious reformers to get anything done. I'll try and give shorter answers. Yes, sir.
Do you think that corporations should be allowed to lobby in Congress? Do you think that?
Sure.
I mean, how do you fix the problem if corporate lobbyists?
Well, just like what I said, you've got to fix the corporate governance kind of issues of the interests so that the directors are truly representing the shareholders. There are outside directors. When I was doing this and had some ability to influence things, of a bank above a certain size, the CEO of the bank was not allowed to be the chairman of the board. The chairman of the board had to be an outsider. There had to be a minimum number, but it had to be a majority of the total number on the board. There were outside directors and were not on a board or management of a bank or financial institution anywhere. Only the audit committee, the audit committee inside the bank could only report to the outside auditors, had to have a meeting every time there was a board meeting without the CEO or management present, whether they had anything to report or not, so it wasn't on an exception basis. And only the outside board of directors could hire the outside accounting firms that reported only to them and not at all to management. We had one case where a commercial bank had outsourced internal audit to the same company they were getting their outside audit from. Ding. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You talk about how the CPI measure has been changed over the past few decades, how now food, energy prices, even some aspects of real estate aren't included in the core CPI. So how really inflation numbers might be really lower than they would have been, when Volcker was head of the Fed.
And changed a lot since then. I can't give you a short answer on that, but basically, of the 16 different measures of the consumer prices that we have, they're all designed to measure an average of prices based on some weights of current output of goods and services. There are no asset prices in there. Housing is in there with a heavy weight, but rental equivalents, and rents don't move with house prices. In the last few months, we've seen a real big spike up in house prices, especially in Las Vegas, where I live, fortunately. Glad to see it happen. But that's not counted as inflation. And mostly what they do, and what they do with the so-called core measures of inflation, the kind of underlying thought is, we don't want to measure the prices of anything that people buy. So we don't include houses, gasoline, and food. But here's the inflation of the rest of it. Well, thanks a lot. For things like indexing Social Security, it's based on, one of the indexes is based on wages, not on actually prices of goods. There's a lot of conceptual flaws with the ways that we measure so-called inflation. And the truth is, there is no one inflation that fits all people. Senior citizens experience a different inflation rate than young people that are forming a family, forming a household, buying furniture, all of that sort of things. And trying to find a inflation rate that would fit all of these different cohorts and segments, or even geographic areas. I mean, the true inflation rate in different parts of the country have been very different at different times, as they're now experiencing in Europe. And in Greece, I don't know, they joined the euro, the Spanish, the Dutch, the Belgians, they all joined the euro. And they say, well, but wait a minute, how can you have one inflation rate that fits all of these people? And escalators and things in their pension funds. In the period, I think it was about 2002 or 3, that when it was, I saw it last measured to about 2008 something, wages and salaries in Greece rose 60% more than they did in Germany, even though productivity rose faster in Germany. So Germany, with low wages and super productivity, is as competitive as hell in world markets, and the Greeks can't even sell their olives. So, other questions? Yes, in the back?
All right, there was an article, I think, about half a year ago about Estonia's recent push toward austerity, as some people call it, and that actually increased growth, and the president got into a fight with a Nobel Prize winner of economics.
Well,
I didn't know.
the guy that used to be an economist, now he's a journalist.
Yeah, I agree. So how would you say some of your principles were applied within that country, if you are able to answer that? So.
Okay, first important question, how many people are confident that they could find Estonia on a map? Some. Yeah. What they did fits this idea that cutting government spending is a true reduction of tax burdens, and it liberates resources for more productive uses. And it's exactly what the United States did after World War I. We went into a deep, sharp depression after the end of the war, and a housing collapse and other things. And you know what the government did? Nada. Nunca, nish, nothing. And the recession and depression lasted about 6 months. People looked around and said, oh, market's now clear, asset prices adjusted, everything adjusted, wages have adjusted. Oh, let's get back to business of making some money. That's what we do. We know how to make money. If there's not sand in the gears of a market economy that prevent it from adjusting. But after the crash of '29, that's not what we did in the '30s, and that became the bigger lesson. We need government pump grinding, means stimulus, increase spending, cut taxes, increase the money supply, increase reserve availability, push down interest rates. For God's sakes, do something, or we will sink forever. And that's kind of the mindset of that journalist Nobel Prize winner you can make reference to. Yes, sir.
Seems like a main theme of your argument here, or your talk, is that rent seeking is causing just massive inefficiencies in government and in the economy. But I'm kind of wondering how the best way to change that, since the lobbying is completely institutionalized and legal. And politicians are hugely incentivized to raise massive amount of funds so they can seek re-election. I don't really think it's the politicians' fault. I think it's kind of that's just, they're humans and they respond to incentives like the rest of us.
Exactly.
And all the laws that they've tried to put in place, a lot of them have been struck down by the Supreme Court, or quite a few. Quite a few of the campaign finance laws.
Well, but there's also been some Supreme Court decisions that are pushing back in the other direction.
So my question is, like, what avenue do you think is the best way to kind of fix or help fix the system?
Well, first is a true belief, understanding, and acceptance of the 9th and 10th Amendments, which means it belongs in the states and the local governments, unless there's a really, really, really strong reason that the states push it up to the federal level. The federal government doesn't take power into itself. It is only granted powers by the states. The 9th and 10th Amendments and direct election, the way we elected, not the current way, that we elected senators were supposed to be the protections. Senators were supposed to be appointed by the legislature or the governor to protect the interests of the state from the tendency of decision-making to gravitate towards the federal government. That got changed with the 17th Amendment, repeal the 17th Amendment, and go back to enumerated powers. This only belongs in the federal government, defense, clear case, if it has been clearly delegated by the majority of the states. But we have to find out whether the majority of the people still believe that. Increasingly, we're getting more governors that believe that, we're getting more legislatures that believe that, but that's where it has to happen. To me, the interesting thing about the gun debate is not guns or no guns, interesting as that might be. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is the responses of the anti-gun people. Do they say, then we'll have to amend the Constitution? Or ignore the Constitution? That latter group really scares me. The amend the Constitution group don't scare me. Because the only way you can amend the Constitution is not only with the supermajority of the Congress, but 3/4 of the states. And if that's the will of the people, then fine, that's the way it is supposed to work. But it still holds the Constitution above all. That's the law of the land. Just ignore the Constitution crowd. If they become a majority, I've got to vote in Canada.
We have time for one more.
One more question.
I'll do a comment.
Yes, sir.
One of the first questions that was asked seemed to suggest that the gentleman down here was, believes that corporations are there to engage in social activities. Well, corporations are designed for people to come together, gather capital, invest that capital, produce goods and services, and make a profit. That's it. If you want to engage in social services, form a nonprofit and go out and do that. But corporations are there to make money, and that is a moral thing to do. And then one of these fellows over here was concerned about lobbyists. Well, there are lobbyists on both sides of it, every issue. All lawyers are dirtbags except for my lawyer, who's a great guy.
Or my nephew.
Yeah, or your nephew. You know, the guy representing you, or she, are good people. You need lobbyists on both sides in order to achieve some sort of balance, because if you don't, things get all out of whack. So that's my brief commentary.
Well, and this was written in, intended to be written into the Constitution. Madison wrote about it a lot in the Federalist Papers, of what he called about counterbalancing factions, as they called them. He said the only way that we can keep this thing in equilibrium and stability is have factions on each side balancing each other out, continuing interests. But that was intended to happen mostly at the state and local level, keeping the minimum amount of decision-making authority at the federal level. We got 4 principal departments of federal government in the Constitution. Everything else is just mistakes we've made. Thank you all very much.